Okay, so we're going to continue our discussion on lifespan development. And previously, in the previous lecture, we were focusing a lot on motor development, development in infants and children. So in this lecture, we're going to be talking about more cognitive development and the development that takes place during your adulthood years. So just a couple of prominent figures here. Of course, we have John Piaget. He was the second most influential psychologist of the 20th century when this came out. And of course, Erik Erikson. So both of these individuals have developed theories of development, of cognitive development more specifically. And so we're going to be talking about their theories in detail and what it is, how it is they thought we developed throughout our lifetime as humans. So first, let's talk about cognitive development. This is the process through which our understanding of the world changes throughout your life. So from the time you're a small child until well into adulthood years. And as children age and they have more experience with the world around them, their cognitive development obviously grows and expands. So unlike the theories of physical and social development, which we previously talked about, the theories we're going to talk about today focus on the quantity, or in other words, the amount of intellectual advances that occur in our lifetime, and the quality of those intellectual advancements. So how much information do we acquire intellectually, and what is the quality of that information that we are acquiring through our development? So Piaget developed the theory of cognitive development, and this theory suggests that children proceed through their development, their cognitive development, in a series of 4 fixed stages, largely based around age. Okay, so each stage is linked with an age in a child's development, and they should enter that stage of cognitive development roughly around the same ages, right? Or within that age span that Piaget has kind of laid out in his theory. And his theory also suggests that when a child reaches a certain level of maturity, or in other words, age, and as they have more experiences with the world that are relevant to that stage of growth, this is what allows the child to progress through each stage. So it's their age, and then, of course, the experience they have with whatever ability is relevant to the stage Piaget is talking about, and that's how he says children proceed through each stage. So again, this theory not only looks at the quantity or the amount of information acquired, but also the quality of that knowledge, of that information, and our understanding of it. So let's talk about each stage and kind of go through them one by one. So the first is the sensory motor stage. So this continues from birth until about 2 years of age. So during this stage, children interact with their environment primarily by touching, sucking, chewing, manipulating objects. You see babies and infants, of course, toddlers. They touch everything. They put everything in their mouth. They manipulate everything, right? They like to try and figure out how things work. They pull things apart. They break things. So that's typically how children are interacting with their environment in this stage. Okay, so they're manipulating objects in every which way in their environment. Now, in this stage, around 9 months is when infants start to develop something called object permanence. So this is where they begin to understand that even if they can no longer see an object, so it's no longer there that they can see, um, they know that the object still exists and they'll look for it. So prior to objects permanence being developed, infants, when they can't see an object, to them, it's gone forever. It disappeared and they have no idea where it is. This is why you can play peekaboo, the game peekaboo, with infants for hours on end, and they're entertained and they giggle every single time. Because until they develop object permanence, they actually think you disappear every single time you cover your face, right? So if you're covering your face with your hands or maybe a little blanket, and then you pop out and you're like, peekaboo, and they laugh and they smile and they just think it's the best thing ever. It's not because you yourself are just the most entertaining human they've ever seen. It's because every time you cover your face, they actually think you went away forever. They think you disappeared into nothing. So when you reappear, it's great fun for them, right? It's not until a child develops object permanence that they actually will begin to look for the objects that are hidden. And at that point, too, typically babies are not as entertained by peekaboo as they previously were. Now you have to make like really loud sounds when you say boo, or you have to make really funny faces to keep their attention because they realize that your face is right behind your hands, right? Once they have object permanence. Additionally, around 9 months and in this stage, infants will begin to imitate your movements and actions. So you can think of things like waving, mom says, wave like this, wave, and then the child learns to imitate around 9 months. Shaking a toy that you shake, so you shake a rattle, they shake a rattle, and so on. Okay, so object permanence and imitation are associated with the sensory motor stage. Okay, the preoperational stage. This second stage occurs from roughly 2 to 7 years of age. So during this stage, children begin to learn language. They can form mental representations of objects and events that might not be physically present in their environment. So for example, if you say apple, the child can picture an apple, right? As long as they've seen an apple before and they know what an apple is, you can say the word apple. And even if there's not an apple that they can see physically in front of them, they can picture in their head what an apple looks like, right? So at this stage, this is when they are able to have these mental representations of objects that maybe they can't see right in front of them. But at this stage, we still have some things going on. So they typically see things from their own point of view, right? So we call this egocentrism. So they can't see things from another point of view. So if I stand behind a wall and I see a flower on that wall, even if I show them, okay, there's a flower on my wall, this is what I see, and you put them on the other side of the wall, let's say they see a clown. I'll say, what do you see? And they'll say, I see a clown. And I'll say, what do I see? And they'll say, well, you see a clown. Even if you showed them that there's a flower on my wall and I see a flower, they cannot see things from other people's perspective. They have a very egocentric point of view of their world. So anything that they describe or explain is going to be from their point of view. I posted a video of a bunch of skills that kids are doing with egocentrism and conservation and centration. So if you watch that video, you'll see the experimenter implementing various tasks with the kids and having them, they ask them, what do I see? What do you see? And so on and so forth. So it's a really interesting video if you kind of want to see these kinds of things in action in this stage of development. So egocentrism. Now, additionally, they tend to be only able to focus on one specific part of a problem. So we refer to this as centration. So they can only see one feature of a problem. They can't see multiple facets of it. So essentially, there's no multitasking at this point. And at this age too, if you ask a child to do a series of things, sometimes they get lost somewhere in the middle. So if you say, do this, then do this, then do this, then do this, and that will fix the issue, right? You actually need to give them step by step because they are unable to focus on more than one part of the problem at a time. And we also see issues with conservation at this stage. So this means that children don't recognize that a substance doesn't change even if its appearance does. So for example, and this is probably something you've seen in various videos or if you watch the video that I posted on Canvas, but if they see two same size glasses and they have the same amount of liquid in them, of course, they'll say at this point, yes, those are equal, right? They have the same. But if you take one of those glasses and pour the liquid into a taller, skinnier glass, so now the water is going to come up higher. Now, you and I would look at that and say, well, of course, it's still the same, right? It's just in a different shaped glass, but the amount of liquid hasn't changed. It just looks taller or looks like there's more because it's in a skinnier glass. But a child during this stage, during the preoperational stage, even when they watch you pour the water into the new glass, will tell you, oh no, now there's more in that one. because the water's higher in a taller, skinnier glass. So they're unable to recognize that just because it looks higher, it might look like there's more. That's actually the same amount of liquid just placed into a different size glass. So the third stage is the concrete operational stage, and this occurs from about 7 to 11 years of age. So mastering conservation, which is what I just described with the liquid in the different glasses, this is one of the hallmarks of entering this stage of development. Okay, so children start to understand conservation during this stage. They're also able to perform certain behaviors with symbolic thoughts. So mentally undoing an action, so they can kind of think back on their actions and how they would undo that, um, without actually doing the action itself. So they can reason through this. You see kids do this a lot with video games, right? So they can sort of reason through certain moves, or maybe think back on moves they did and understand why they did or did not succeed on the game. So symbolic thoughts, so right, so thinking about an action rather than actually engaging in or doing the action yourself. They also develop the ability to see something from someone else's perspective, right? So no longer an egocentric point of view, they can actually see from someone else's point of view. And they can also focus on more than one feature of a problem, which we refer to as decentration. So remember, in the previous stage, pre-operational stage, they had issues with centration. So now they don't. That's called decentration. So basically during this stage, children essentially have learned or mastered all of the things they were incapable of doing during the pre-operational stage. Okay, so that's how we know they've sort of moved in the concrete operational stage. They've now accomplished those things they had issues with in the previous stage. And Piaget's final fourth stage is the formal operational stage. So this starts around 11 years of age and continues into pre-adolescence and adulthood. So this is where children start to think in more abstract concepts. So things like love, justice, morality, things like that. They can understand pros and cons, for example. So that's another abstract sort of thought or concept. So being able to reason through um, maybe purchasing an expensive item, right? So children at this stage would be able to engage in this more abstract reasoning of a pro versus a con, and what you benefit from getting this item versus what you lose when you pay all this money, and so on and so forth. So that's the formal operational stage. And here's just a snapshot of all four stages and the main aspects of each stage and the approximate behavior each occurs during each stage. So keep in mind, this is only one theory of development, and it's one that, you know, people do find fault with. So I would say it's one of the more well-known theories. And it is certainly taught in a multitude of classes, but it isn't the only explanation for how children progress through these behaviors. Some may argue that children might engage in these behaviors, for example, long before or much after the ages that Piaget is set here. And they argue that, well, if Piaget's theory was accurate, then all children should progress through these stages at the same time, right? Because they are according to ages, not according to individual experiences. But other people will argue, well, that no, actually they do progress and develop through these based on individual experiences. Myself, I'm a behavior analyst, so behavior analysis, for example, do not adhere to this theory of Piaget's theory. So we look at a child's learning history. If their learning history is such that they've been exposed more to something, say like object permanence and an experience around that, then they might learn this skill much faster than somebody else. So let me give you an example of this. I did witness this with my son. So he was not very old, probably 4 or 5 months, when he developed object permanence. Now, according to Piaget, that wouldn't be possible. He would have to be much older. However, he had an older sister who hid literally everything from him. He crawled and rolled at a very young age. Again, he was trying to keep up with his sister. So he would get into her stuff all the time. So she would hide it, which would work for about a month until he realized that it's actually not gone. She just put it somewhere else and I need to find it. So I actually watched him learn this at a very young age. And again, I would attribute this to his learning history. His experiences with his environment are such that he has been exposed to having objects hidden multiple times, maybe more so than most children, because my daughter was also very type A, like very, she wanted everything put away in just a certain spot and everything lined up in a certain way. She's very organized, she's very particular about her stuff. So she really didn't like him touching it. So she would go through extreme lengths to hide all her stuff from him. So he was probably exposed to it more than I would argue, most children are. But because of that repeated exposure to having objects hidden from him, he learned much faster. He learned faster that he needed to look for those objects, that they didn't just disappear into nowhere. So again, there are, other theories of explaining development in humans, and this is just one. And we do teach this one in your basic psychology courses because this, like I said, is the most well-known theory. But if you are interested in psychology or you're majoring in that and you start to take different classes, you'll sort of see all of the different perspectives and theories that come into play. So if you take a class on personality, they might interpret this slightly different. If you take a class on, of course, behavior analysis versus, a drugs and behavior class, they kind of look more at the biology side of things. So, you're going to be exposed to other theories too if you continue your path in psychology and take those other classes. So just a little side note there, just to keep in mind. Okay, let's talk about another theory of cognitive development. So this is Erik Erikson's psychosocial development theory. So again, this theory is similar to Piaget in the sense that it assumes that individuals progress through each stage in a specific order, and one builds on the other. And similarly, each stage closely relates to an individual's age. So as they progress through the stages, they'll progress based on an average age, essentially. Okay, so similar to Piaget's theory in that sense. Now, there are a total of 8 stages in Erikson's theory, and the first 4 occur during our childhood and pre-adolescence. So we're going to talk about the first 4 here now. So the first stage is trust versus mistrust. So this occurs from birth to about 1 year of age. And during this stage, the infant largely depends on their caregiver for all of their needs. Like we talked about in the previous lecture, when infants are born, they really can't take care of themselves, right? They depend on their caregiver for just about anything. So if the infant is taken care of as they should be, the infant will have, according to Erikson, will have a more trusting view of the world overall, okay? If they're taken care of and their needs are met. However, if they're neglected or they're not cared for in any way, the child may develop a more mistrusting view of the world. And you do see this with kids who have maybe a typical caring home where all their needs are provided for. Mom and dad clearly love them. They take care of them. They're well fed, they're clothed, and so on and so forth. They really don't have any worries, these children, right? They just always trust that things will be fine because from their point of view, it always has been fine, right? Because they were provided for. Versus those children who have had to kind of fend for themselves. They have a vastly different point of view of the world and they tend not to trust it as much because it hasn't been as reliable for them, maybe as those children who had everything taken care of for them. Stage 2 is known as the autonomy versus shame and doubt stage. So this occurs from about 1 to 3 years of age. So during this stage, the child begins to take personal responsibility for themselves and they develop a sense of self sufficiency if they're given the freedom to do so. Okay, so that's the key right there. If parents are too controlling or they don't encourage the child's independence, they don't allow them to do things on their own. This could result in the child having feelings of shame or doubt, right? They're unsure of whether they can actually do things versus having that sort of self sufficient or self surety feeling. And this is actually really hard as a parent. I think most parents end up falling on both sides of this. For those of you who have children, you can probably relate to this a little bit because we want our children to be independent. That is the goal when you're teaching children to do things and encouraging them to try it on their own. You want them to feel like they can be anything and do anything and be successful in anything, right? That's sort of your job as a parent is to, the world is out there to sort of beat down on your kid. So you should probably be a slight safe haven for them at home, right? Sort of encouraging them and pushing them to be all that they can be. But sometimes we have to also stop them and discourage them, maybe to keep them safe, right? So you kind of are walking both sides of this. You don't want them to be unsure of themselves or have self doubt, but sometimes it's for their own safety. I remember when my son was about 2 years old, and he is definitely one of those kids. Knock on wood, I'm so grateful we've never had to go to the ER with a broken bone or anything with him. I'm kind of shocked. But he's a very energetic little kid. He's one of those kids, he gets a little twinkle in his eye and he's thinking like, yeah, it's probably not a good idea, but I'm going to try it anyways. So this happened when he was about 2. I was sitting in a recliner chair across from the couch, and he confidently climbed up to the top of our couch, proclaimed that he was now a kid who could fly, and launched himself out straight out from the couch. I mean, just no holds bar. I mean, arms out, like convinced that he was about to take flight and show everyone that he was now a child who could fly. Now, as you've guessed, he did a nice, really awful, hard belly flop face plant onto our hard living room floor. And after he and I had calmed down, we were sure there were no serious injuries, had to sort of bring him off his high stool, right? And tell him, okay, well, when mom says you can do anything you want, I don't actually mean that. Like you do have physical limitations. You can't do anything that you want to do. And I remember his little face sort of just crumbling a little bit, and sort of asking me, like, well, so I'm not like amazing, like I can't do all of these things. And now, as a parent, that's a hard conversation because you sort of see this self-doubt creep into them and their way of thinking. Um, but yeah, so I've definitely experienced both sides of this. But this is a stage that children go through, according to Erickson, in terms of the spectrum of autonomy versus self-doubt and how children experience this. So, stage 3 is the initiative versus guilt stage. So, this occurs from about 4 to 6 years of age. So, during this stage, children are experiencing a sort of pull between wanting to have their own independence but also feeling guilty when certain acts of independence don't really work out, right? They're unsuccessful, maybe they don't pay off. So you have this sort of like initiative, I'm going to do this, but then when it doesn't work out, it's sort of guilt of, oh, maybe I shouldn't have done that, or I didn't do it very well, and so on and so forth. Interactions within the family unit are also really important during this stage. So this is the environment where children typically feel the most at ease in terms of exerting their independence, and especially at the ages of 4 to 6, kids are largely still at home. They don't start kindergarten until late 5 or early 6 years of age. So the home environment is where they're sort of learning this initiative to be independent and do things on their own. But again, if a parent is too controlling and they don't allow for this sort of exploration or independence at home, then the child is more likely to feel guilty or constrained and have issues later on when they do try to exert their independence in society outside of the family unit. Which leads us to the fourth stage, which is industry versus inferiority stage. So this occurs from about 6 to 12 years of age. And this is where children start to learn how to function socially outside of that family unit, as I just mentioned. So if this is achieved successfully, so if they're able to integrate socially and exert their independence just like they have been allowed to at home, um, a sense of competence should evolve. Successful social development is sort of characterized by this stage, according to Erickson. So if they can successfully function outside of the family unit, then they've had a successful social development experience. However, those who have difficulty in this stage, so they don't integrate well with other kids, maybe they don't have success in acting independently or they don't act independently at all, they can develop a sense of incompetence or, of course, inferiority. And again, here are the first four stages of Erickson's psychosocial theory. Remember, there's a total of 8. But the first 4 deal with before adolescence, right? So this is in the ages of children. Okay, so these are just the first 4 stages. We'll talk about the next 4 in just a moment. So the next 4 stages, Erickson suggests, occur during one's adolescence, which is the developmental stage between childhood and adulthood, okay, the teenagers. So of course, a child's going to go through puberty. This typically starts off the adolescent stage, right? With this occurring for most girls around 11 or 12, give or take. Some are earlier, some are later. And for most boys around 13 to 14. During this phase of development, of course, we have the maturation of sexual organs occurring. We see various weight or height increases in most children, hair growth, and so on. All those fun things we had to go through doing puberty. Okay, so let's talk about the last 4 stages of psychosocial development according to Erickson. And again, like I said, the first 4 focused on childhood, whereas the last 4 largely focus on finding one's identity, which happens during the adolescent years. So finding an understanding of your own self, other individuals, and the world around you. So how do you fit into your own world? Okay, so these are the stages 5 through 8 in Erickson's theory that focus on this. So the 5th stage is the identity versus role confusion stage. And the goal of this stage is that the individual successfully deals with issues of identity and their future role as an adult. So that's what you want to come out with when you come out of this stage, right? So trying to identify what makes you unique from everybody else, or discover who or what your strengths are, and so on and so forth. So those aspects all encompass your identity and what makes up you, right? What makes you special or individual from everyone else. Now, most of us have experienced that this is an extremely difficult stage, right? And sometimes one that really isn't fully realized until you're an adult. So even though Erickson states that all of these stages occur during preadolescence, a lot of people would argue this is where they start, but this isn't necessarily where they end. Because, as an adult too, you recognize that you change over the years. You change in your 20s, you change in your 30s, and you might have a new identity role, right? Or identity confusion, the midlife crisis, right? Trying to figure out who you are. So I would argue that, yes, I think that we go through these stages and maybe they start in adolescence, but I'm not sure that that's where they end, right? I think that they are sort of ongoing, evolving stages that you may go through more than once in your life, unfortunately. Um, but people who really struggle in this stage too, especially children, they might start to take on maladaptive identities, which basically means that these are identities that don't benefit them in any way. So if they don't fit in, they might fall into the wrong group, declare themselves a deviant, right? Getting into trouble, being an outsider, and things like that. So they have trouble forming relationships, and that can create sort of identity confusion or role confusion. The sixth stage is the intimacy versus isolation stage. So this typically occurs during young adulthood. So this is from about post-adolescence until about mid-30s. Success in this stage results in developing deep and intimate relationships with others. And difficulties in this stage result in feelings of loneliness, um, and people often end up isolating themselves if they struggle in this stage rather than trying to develop those deep relationships that sort of carry you through adulthood. Erickson did say that this can be resolved, right? So this crisis of feeling lonely or isolated, you can overcome this. And if you can, you'll succeed in forming intimate relationships. So it's really looking at building relationships this stage, right? So are you open to being intimate? And that doesn't mean, this isn't only talking about a romantic relationship. This is talking about your friendships, maybe your relationships with your family. Your relationship with your parents certainly changes as you go into young adulthood. And how is that going to look? Are you going to isolate yourself from them? Or are you just going to transition into a different type of relationship, right? That is still intimate and caring and so on and so forth. The seventh stage is generativity versus stagnation stage. So this is experienced during about middle adulthood. So success in this stage is measured by one's ability to successfully contribute to your family unit and or society. So whether this means providing for yourself or your family, right, or contributing to provide for your family in some way, or if you don't have a family, contributing in the workplace, contributing to society, so maybe by mentoring the younger generation. This is what we look at when we look at this stage. So success in this stage leads one to be content with their own continuation in life, right? So not being afraid of entering the later years, they're happy with where they're at, they're ready for the next stage, and they're proud of what they've accomplished so far. So it's essentially in this stage, if you're successful in this stage, you're sort of left with feeling happy with where your life has taken you and where it's going. Okay, so that's kind of where the success in this stage is at. Whereas any difficulty experience in this stage can lead people to feel like their life accomplishments have been unimportant or trivial, or maybe they even really haven't accomplished that much, right? Doesn't mean anything. They may feel like they have made poor choices and they're not happy with where they have ended up and they're not looking forward to continuing, right? So the path that they're on currently, they're maybe not excited about that path continuing. And in middle adulthood, this is often when we see the midlife crisis, right? People who are unsuccessful in this stage or don't do well in this stage, who are unhappy with where their life has brought them, they often try to take a very drastic turn, right, to change where their life is headed. So it isn't always a bad thing. I think when we think about midlife crises, we think about, the really awful examples, right? Like the 50-year-old man who runs off with the 19-year-old girl. Or I don't know, the woman who leaves her family and goes to a different country to find herself. I think we think of like these really drastic sort of negative examples, but it doesn't always have to be that. I think it can just mean that you are starting to look at your life and where you have brought yourself, and if it's not a place that you wanted to be, it's not a bad thing to change things up sometimes, and see if you can make the rest of your life a happy one, right? And a worthwhile one, something that you are proud of. You are an adult for most of your life, if you think about it. You're only a child for about 11 years. You're a teen for another 8 to 9, and then you become an adult. And so, from about 20 to anywhere from 80 to 90 years old, however you feel, it's like 70 years of your life is being an adult. So I think that's why a lot of people get about halfway through it, and if they're not happy, they try to make a change. Okay, and the final eighth stage in Erickson's theory is integrity versus despair. So this happens during later adulthood until one passes. During this stage, people look back on their life to see if it was meaningful, right? So they either see their lives positively, they feel they had meaning, they have a sense of accomplishment. So if they're looking back on their life as a whole, they're like, you know what? Yeah, this was a good life. I had a good life. I did a lot of cool things. It had meaning. But if in this stage they look back on their life and they don't have those same feelings, right? They may feel like they um, didn't do anything of note or of meaning. They might experience feelings of despair or regret that they didn't lead a full life. So the stage right before this, in the generativity versus stagnation, that one is more looking at what have I accomplished so far and what am I still going to do? Versus this last stage is looking back on your life as a whole, right? Everything that you've done and has it added up to something of meaning. So, according to Erickson and his last four stages, um, the identity versus role confusion that takes place during adolescence, and then the final three stages typically take place during adulthood. Although, like I said before, I think that identity versus role confusion might come up a few more times, even in adulthood, and not necessarily only in adolescence. So, something to keep in mind. So moving on to moral development, Lawrence Kohlberg, he was the one who developed a stage theory of moral development based on individuals' responses to various moral dilemmas that are presented to them. And Kohlberg wasn't so much, when he first did this, he wasn't really so much interested in their actual answers, right? So he's not looking at their answers and dissecting what these answers mean. What he's looking at is the person's reasoning. So, what led them to their answer? What is the reasoning behind the answer they eventually give? And Kohlberg's theory states that people progress through three levels of moral development as we age, so from child to adulthood, with each stage representing a different way of thinking about what is right or wrong. So let's look at an example and talk about how one might reason through this example in each of the moral development stages. So I'm going to read it out loud. A woman was near death from a special kind of cancer. There was one drug that the doctors thought might save her. It was a form of radium that a druggist in the same town had recently discovered. The drug was expensive to make, but the druggist was charging 10 times what the drug cost him to produce. He paid $200 for the radium and charged $2,000 for a small dose of the drug. The sick woman's husband, Heinz, went to everyone he knew to borrow the money, but he could only get together about $1,000, which is half of what it cost. He told the druggist that his wife was dying and asked him to sell it cheaper or let him pay later. But the druggist said, "No, I discovered the drug and I'm going to make money from it." So Heinz got desperate and broke into the man's store to steal the drug for his wife. So the question is, should Heinz have broken into the laboratory to steal the drug for his wife? Why or why not? And we're going to look at how people answer this question depending on the stage of morality development that they are in. And this does happen. This example is pretty relevant. You have drug companies who are selling these drugs. They're very, very expensive. One example I can think of off the top of my head is diabetic drugs. They're extremely expensive. The price is blown out of proportion. And people who don't have great insurance are paying anywhere from, several hundred to $1,000 or $2,000 a month just to get a prescription that keeps them alive, right? They need those drugs. They need the insulin to keep their sugar levels where they should be, especially type 1 diabetes, right? Where their body just doesn't produce the insulin. It's a problem. It's a big problem that we have here in the United States, that people can't get the drugs that they need to survive because they cost so much. So let's look at how people reason their way through why Heinz should or should not steal the drugs. So at the pre-conventional level, the main consideration is avoiding punishment or earning rewards. Okay, so this is something we think of when you're younger, when you're a child, right? So if we're thinking about the previous example, if someone was in this stage of moral development, you would reason, well, you can't steal the drugs because you could get arrested and go to jail, right? So you're avoiding punishment. Or you have to steal the drugs so your wife will live, the reward, right? Earning a reward of some kind. So you can think of this stage as the most simplistic when you're looking at whether something is right or wrong. It's just avoiding what is bad, or looking for what good that you get out of it. Okay, so it's a very simplistic way of answering the question. Either for those that are in the camp of stealing the drug, yes, you have to. The reward is your wife will live. The others say, no, don't steal the drug, you'll go to jail. For us who are older, we know it's not as simple as all that, right? So let's look at the second stage. So at the conventional level, your membership in society now becomes important. So you start to behave in ways that is going to win the approval of others because it matters, if you fit into society. So, for example, for those that are in favor of stealing the drugs, um, no one would blame you for stealing the drugs. You could hold your head up high. Everyone would know you were just doing what you had to do to save your wife. And they might even look poorly on you if you didn't do this, right? If you didn't do everything you could to save your wife. Those on the other side who say you shouldn't steal the drugs at the conventional level would argue, well, everyone might view me as a criminal, right? They might see me poorly, or people will wonder, was there anything else you could have done before you tried to steal the drugs, right? So your membership in society, where you stand in society, is important. And finally, we have the post-conventional level. So you start to accept that there are broad underlying principles of morality. So individual acts are judged not only by society, right? So you have your place in society, but also by your own self, your own personal code of ethics. For you as an individual in certain circumstances. And I think that's what a lot of us were probably thinking through all this, it's not as simple as, well, you'll go to jail, or it's not as simple as, well, people will look poorly on you. There are other things that are individualistic to you and your own moral and ethic code that has developed through your lifetime. So maybe if you're on the side of stealing the drugs, your reasoning would be that your own moral principle doesn't allow you to simply do nothing when you know you can save your wife's life. A lot of people might argue this. They might say, okay, well, so what? I might go to jail and people might look poorly on me, but my wife will live. And that's what matters to me. I wouldn't be able to live with myself if I didn't do this and save my wife's life. I'm sure you've heard people say that many times in situations. I wouldn't be able to live with myself if I did this or didn't do this, right? And what we're talking about there is your own personal code of ethics and how you judge your own behaviors outside of how you stand in society. So if you're on maybe the side of not stealing the drugs, you might reason that you have an underlying principle of honesty or a strong conscience that you cannot simply change your own principles whenever it suits you, right? So your conscience won't let you betray your own moral code. So you can't steal the drugs as much as you want to save your wife's life because you have such an ethical, strong belief, that you can't steal or you can't break the law, right? Or you can't be dishonest. So it's those own personal code of ethics that you don't want to violate. Okay. So that's the third level of moral development, the post-conventional level. And it's a really interesting question to ask yourself. I remember the first time I was presented with that dilemma, with the man and the wife and the drugs. And I remember my initial knee-jerk reaction was like, oh, steal the drugs, like totally steal the drugs. Why wouldn't you? But I think it's interesting if you think about whatever your answer was, think about why it is. Why is that? Why do you think that way? And for me, my moral ethical code that I hold myself to, it would be to do everything I could possibly do to save someone's life. And if I have the ability to do that, I'm going to do it, no matter the consequences to me as an individual. Um, so whereas others might argue strongly against that, and that's okay. Ask yourself why. So what moral ethical code do you have that you would argue, no, no, we can't violate that. We can't steal the drugs. We have to find another way. So everyone's going to have an individualistic answer. They might be similar, but you'll have your own reasons, your own moral ethical code that you stand by, right? That's individual to you. Okay. So, as I kind of mentioned before, a majority of your life is spent in adulthood. You're really a child for such a short time, an adolescent for even shorter, and then you're an adult for the rest of your life, right? So the book goes into great detail about, I don't know, all the different hormonal changes and the development of adults and menopause and all these things. I'm not going to be quizzing you on all that on the exam. So just so you're aware, if you want to read all of that for your own interest and your own learning, great. But I can't test you on everything. And I think that the theories of development, of cognitive development and motor development and morality development, I think that those are more important. I think if you want to learn about all the biology behind it, you can take a biology class. So just so you guys know, that part of the book won't be on the exam. And a lot of the landmarks in adult development, because we're an adult for so long, they involve some sort of transition in familial relationships, right? So you can think of a number of these transitions. The first change I can think of is when you move out of your own family unit, right? So when you are around the age of 18, some early, some a little later, but you're an adult, you're no longer the child, and your relationship with your parent sort of shifts, right? You're standing on more equal ground with them. Now, some may feel differently about this. I know that I certainly became an adult in my parents' eyes when I turned 18. But even now at 36, I still have respect for them and defer to them. I don't talk to them to the same way that I might talk to my friends. I still show a sense of deference or respect to my parents because they'll always be my parents, right? I'll never consider myself on fully equal ground with them. But our relationship has definitely shifted over the years from me being the child and them being the parent, right? And now that I'm a parent myself, it shifts again, and so on and so forth. So, like I mentioned, of course, if you decide to get married or enter into a long term relationship of any kind, lots of people do that as well. They just choose not to put it on paper, which is great and totally fine. Or if you decide to have children, you'll experience the relationship changes again, right? And you'll experience them with your own children. So when they become an adolescent and then they become adults, and those relationships with you and your kids will change much in the same way that it did with you and your own parents. So the cycle sort of starts all over again. So you experience these relationship transitions all throughout your life. And even if you don't ever get married or you never have children, you're going to experience these changes with friendships too. Or maybe if you work somewhere for a really long time, you'll have transitions of relationships there too. Maybe you become a supervisor with someone over someone you were friends with at work. Or friendships, that you have when you're very young, but as you get older and you change and you have different experiences, you might grow apart, and so on and so forth. So these relationship transitions make up a large part of development during adulthood. So it's just why I wanted to kind of mention them and bring them to your attention. Because you're constantly experiencing them, right? So from the time you move out on your own until your life is over, you're navigating a number of relationship transitions during adulthood. And finally, we're going to talk about the development of humans that occurs in our later years. So we have to include getting old, right? Um, it's not something everyone looks forward to and loves talking about, but it is part of your development as a human, right? It is the end of your life. And there are changes that happen. You are still developing in certain ways at this age, at the end of your life. So Of course, there are obvious physical changes, right? So you have change in appearance. The skin usually becomes different looking. It loses its elasticity. Sometimes you lose hair, or your hair turns color, right? Turns gray, so you lose the melanin in the hair. Um, Sensory loss can be another form of development. So, you can't hear as well, you can't see as well, and so on. And of course, there are cognitive changes as well. So, overall, research has demonstrated that cognitive functions remain fairly stable, with only slight declines in IQ after you pass the age of 60. But what we see is some decline with certain types of memory. So, cognitively and your IQ, your intelligence isn't going to change that much, but your in certain memories and memory retention will change during this age. So, episodic memories, we do see those decline with age. Those are memories that are more individual specific memories. Okay, so specific memories to you as an individual versus semantic memories, which these are more general facts or general knowledge. Okay, those tend to stay intact, whereas your episodic memories, those that are individual to you, tend to decline with age. And we tend to see different rates of decline for different types of cognitive abilities. So as you can see here, this is a graph with different abilities listed. Oops, sorry. And one example we can just look at. So you see the blue line, which represents numeric abilities, so calculations. This tends to decline with age much earlier than something like verbal ability, which is that orange line. And you see that pretty much stay even, and then it doesn't start to go down until much later in life. So overall, any abilities that relate to fluid intelligence, which we're going to talk about in a minute, but this includes skills like memory, calculation, so that's why you see the math one go down earlier, and analogical reasoning. So these tend to decline more rapidly. Okay. Whereas any abilities relating to crystallized intelligence, which includes skills such as intelligence based on the accumulation of information, so like we talked about previously, general knowledge, or strategies learned through experience, those tend to stay very stable. So, fluid and crystallized intelligence. So, fluid intelligence is the ability to reason without relying heavily on previously learned knowledge. So that means like you don't have to use the knowledge that you've learned before. You're able to solve a problem with new solutions, right? So if you're presented with a new problem, you're able to solve it using a new strategy rather than having to pull from past knowledge. So this is what we're talking about with things like calculations, analogical reasoning, right? The if then, if this, then that. You use this type of intelligence when you take the GRE, right? There's a real world example right there. If any of you have ever taken it or you're studying for it, if you're getting ready for grad school. They are problems and word associations that you've probably never seen before. Maybe you've seen similar ones. So you use your knowledge in a sense of what you've already learned, but you have to find a new strategy to solve the problem in front of you. And so that's fluid intelligence. Whereas crystallized intelligence relies on knowing facts and being able to combine them. So this is accumulated knowledge that you've accumulated over time. And these are associated also with semantic memories. So I talked about how those are more general knowledge memories, that those tend to stick with you and don't decline with age, versus the episodic memories, right? So both longitudinal and cross-sectional studies have been done. So in a longitudinal study, just to remind you, maybe if you don't know, this is where groups of people have been studied over a very long period of time. So they follow the same people over, 20, 40 years, something like that. And cross-sectional studies are where groups are studied just during very specific points in time. Okay, so they're not observed through the entire time span. But both these studies, both longitudinal and cross-sectional, have demonstrated that fluid intelligence is more likely to decline. Okay, so those things where you are able to solve a problem with new solutions, right? You don't rely on previous knowledge. That type of intelligence, fluid intelligence, will decline as we age. Whereas crystallized intelligence remains fairly stable until the end of life. So that intelligence where you have facts and you're able to combine them, and it's that accumulated general knowledge throughout your lifetime that will remain fairly stable even as you age. And there are some review questions that you can go through on the rest of these slides, but that is all for lifespan development.